So welcome, and thank you for joining the Berkeley Economics Speakers Series. I'm Raka Ray, I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences. I want to first thank the faculty of our wonderful economics department for their efforts in creating this series. Special thanks to Professor Danny Yagan for coordinating our topics and our speakers, as well as for his work as development chair for Berkeley Economics. This is the fourth installment of the Berkeley Economics Speaker Series, and I first want to say how delighted I am to welcome Sarah Rahimian to the podium to introduce our program. Let me introduce Sarah Rahimian to you. Over the past 3 decades, she has worked as an engineering leader across an array of industries, most recently as senior manager in the enterprise networking space at Google. Sarah met her husband, Chris Harrelson, is he here? Is that it? While studying at UC Berkeley. We always like to hear these stories. And they have been committed to giving back to our campus and have enabled the launch of a new course titled Political Discourse in the 21st Century. She also gives of her time and insights as a member of the College of Letters and Sciences Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, to those here in person, as well as those joining via Zoom all across the country. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Supreet Kaur. Professor Kaur's research studies how incorporating concepts from psychology can deepen our understanding of poverty. She is a recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award, the Sloan Research Fellowship Award, and the CES-IFO Distinguished Affiliation Award in Behavioral Economics. She is the co-founder of the Psychology and Economics of Poverty Initiative at UC Berkeley. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Supreet Kaur for her talk, The Psychology of Poverty.
Thank you, Sarah, for that warm welcome. Let me turn on my mic. Okay, does that seem to be on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Great. All right, so as Sarah mentioned, today I'm going to be speaking about the psychology of poverty. So to start, let me beat down on my own discipline for just a second. So economists typically have had a very narrow view of what it means to be poor, and part of that comes from the way we define poverty. So we define poverty literally as not having enough money to fulfill your basic needs, right? That's how the poverty line is drawn. And because we view poverty in this way, and economists are so influential in guiding policy debates around anti-poverty policy, that really influences then the shape of anti-poverty policies in the US and across the world. If the problem is not having enough money, then the solution is to give people money. So if you think of unemployment insurance, food stamps, cash transfer programs, universal basic income, a lot of these are based on that premise. And while of course that's super important and obviously very accurate, thinking about poverty in this way is useful for measurement, but it takes a very narrow view of what poverty is. It misses a lot of what it means to be poor. So to give you an example, poor people face an incredible amount of volatility in their lives that is different from just having a low level of income. So this, for example, is data from US food and retail workers. And this is just plotting on the y-axis, the share of workers who in the past month have had a particular disruption in terms of having uncertainty about their shifts. So for example, almost 20% of workers have had at least one shift just canceled in the past month with little notice. Over 60% of workers have had at least one last minute change to their shift or less than 2 weeks notice about a shift change. So this just gives you a sense of how just volatile your day-to-day, even understanding of when you're gonna get work and how much you're gonna earn is. Things are even worse when you look at developing countries. So this is the income of a woman named Pumza, who's a vegetable vendor in South Africa. And this is just plotting every 2 weeks how much money she makes. And you can sort of see, the y-axis is hard to see, but in 1 month, her income goes from 90 to 20. And that is completely unforeseeable. So in addition to balancing all this volatility of not really knowing how much money you're gonna have come in on a given day, poor people also face an incredible amount of shocks to how much money they need on a given day. because they get hit with things like health shocks and other emergencies. So this is data from a few different developing countries, just showing the sample of people who had a catastrophic event that created a financial emergency in the past year. And like half of households, for example, tend to have a serious injury or illness that creates a large financial emergency. And so you have to manage all of this volatility in income with all of this volatility in how you have to pay for cash. And that creates an incredible amount of stress and anxiety. But volatility is just one of the ways in which poor people differ from rich people. There's tons of other stuff. If you are a poor person, you likely live in an environment with a lot more crime. So if you're a high schooler who lives in an inner city neighborhood, you might be running home from school so that you don't get jumped on the way home. And those kinds of considerations are part of what's top of mind for you as you go about your day-to-day life. There's, of course, things like the quality of schooling and whether you have access to savings and credit and the kind of social environment you live in and the kinds of stereotypes and discrimination you kind of face day to day. So all of these things have come with their own psychological and social consequences. And these consequences are important for us to understand and recognize if we want to understand the choices and behaviors of people in poverty. And what I'm going to try to convince you of this talk is that if we understand that aspect of poverty, that can really transform our approach to anti-poverty policy and make it much more effective. So I'm going to start by just thinking about how is it that we think if you're a low-income person, you should climb out of poverty? What are the things we think people should do or can do? And so I'm going to start with sort of three pillars that are kind of, top of mind. So if you're in the US and in many developing countries, you have access to free education. So we think you can go to school, which helps you improve your lot in life. In the US, this is like one of the best ways out of poverty. So you go get an education, you go get a job, you work hard, and then you save up that money, and that's how you achieve upward mobility. And what I want to do is take each of these three pillars of how a person pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and give you one example in each scenario of how we might see behaviors that seem incongruent with somebody really trying to climb their way out of poverty, and then highlight how understanding the psychology of poverty can change our interpretation of that behavior and provide suggestions for very different kinds of policy solutions. So let me start with education. So I'm going to first start with a psychology, like a feature of behavior. So what I'm showing here is data from the TIMSS exam, which is this big test that's like administered in like over 50 countries around the world to fourth graders, and it's a math and science exam. And one of the cool things about this exam as a researcher is that they randomize the question order across students. So some students might get a particular question, like what is 4 + 4, as question number 2 of the exam, and other students are going to get that as question number 20 of the exam. And so what that allows you to do is to say when the same question comes earlier versus later in the exam, how do people do? And what I'm plotting here is for the US math and science and globally performance in math and science. And the y-axis is what fraction of people got a question right. And so this is really just saying when that same question appears later, what happens? And what you can kind of see is like a decline over time. Can you all see the slides okay? Everyone can see them? Okay, good. So, and that is like a telltale sign of cognitive fatigue. We were talking about thinking fast and slow earlier and attentional capacity earlier. So this is like a telltale sign. And this is like a very human thing. All of us have this. All of you are going to start flagging in like minute 25 of my talk. And too bad. Like I'm going to try to be like a little more animated, but there's nothing I can do about it. So, so this is just like a feature of human behavior. But what's kind of interesting is we went and looked at this data. And we broke up this data by socioeconomic status, SES. And when you do that, what you see is that the low SES students, the poor students, decline a lot faster than the rich ones. This is true in the US, this is true globally. So it seems like poor people just somehow have worse attentional capacity. Something about their cognitive capacity maybe looks less. So how should we understand this fact? And we've replicated this fact in lots of settings, and it's also not just limited to students. So in addition to education, this is data this is from data entry workers who are doing data entry work in India. Here, I'm just looking at the number of data entry mistakes over the course of the workday, and you can see this low SES workers, their accuracy rate falls much more fast than the richer ones over the course of the workday. So that helps the richer guys earn more money. You can look at voting. This is work by colleagues here at Berkeley. So they're basically looking at I took their data and looking at high versus low SES precincts in California. And if you look at a ballot proposition and you just look at the order in which that proposition appears earlier versus later in the ballot, The y-axis is measuring what share of people are making an active choice versus just picking the default. And you can see that they kind of start off about similar in what they pick, and then the low SES people decline just like much faster. And these authors estimate that if you didn't have these cognitive fatigue effects, on average, something like 5% more ballot propositions would have become law in California. So this is quite consequential, and it's really different for poor and rich people. So how should we understand why we see these differences? So one thing when we went and looked in the psychology literature, psychologists have believed is that the capacity for sustained attention, this sort of contentional capacity, might be malleable. And it might be possible that if you practice paying sustained attention, you might get better at it. So we took that idea and we decided to go and test it. And so, but to motivate that test, we first looked at time use surveys from teachers, again, in that TIMSS data across the world. And you can just look at what teachers in rich schools versus poor schools are doing. And one of the things you see is that actually rich kids get to spend a lot more time in school in sustained focus practice. So this is on the y-axis in both these graphs, again, globally in the US, is the amount of time in school people spend in sustained focus practice. And poor kids just get less of it than rich kids across the board, 40% less in the US. And so what we want to ask is, could this specific feature of school pedagogy matter? Like we think about good versus bad schools, but let's delve down into a specific thing, could it matter? So we did as a randomized trial with about 1,600 elementary school students in India. And it was a randomized trial, so we had a control group that just got status quo education, that's what that looks like. And then we had some treatment groups where we just gave them what rich kids get. We gave them the opportunity in school to spend 20 minutes at a time in sustained focused practice. So we made their school day a little bit more like the rich kids' school day, just for 20 minutes at a time over the course of a year. So in total, they did about 10 to 20 hours of increased focus practice. And we saw that that really changed their attentional capacity. So the dotted line on the bottom is the cognitive of how fast the control group declines in listening comprehension. So there's nothing to do with when we give them practice, they did math problems, they did tangrams, puzzles, that kind of thing. This is just, can you listen to something and attend to it and like remember, was the cat brown or black if you heard a story, or was it a dolphin or a whale or that sort of thing. And you see just like cognitive fatigue, people decline, but the people who are treated decline less quickly. They look more like rich kids now. You can also give them an IQ test. When you give kids an IQ test, the poor kids, the control group declines, as you would expect, but now the treated group declines less quickly. In fact, we don't even see a lot of decline. And so by looking at this, it's almost like we've made those kids smarter, because it's an IQ test, but all we've done is given them the chance to attend school that looks a little bit more like what rich kids get. The sum of this, the most important thing is then at the end of the year, just how do they do in school? These kids do better in their normal school. The grades they get at the end of the year in school are about 0.1 standard deviations higher in Hindi, English, and math. Even though we didn't teach them any Hindi, none of the practice involved English, we had nothing to do with language, but they do better even in these other things because their listening comprehension, their attentional capacity, their behavior in class is improved. You can compare those effects with more expensive or intensive interventions. So these are kind of ones that are considered really successful things in the education literature. You can put an extra teacher in the classroom, and in the US, you get a 0.12 standard deviation gain from doing that. We were 0.1 from 20 hours of practice. You can do tracking where you're splitting kids up. In Kenya, they got those effects. But these are interventions where you're changing something about every single day and every minute of the student's sort of existence in school over the school year, and the grades you're measuring are for the things they actually learned. And we get these incredible improvements at a fraction of the cost with something much more light touch. So what do we take away from this? Well, one takeaway is just that we've learned, which is something that was not clear because psychologists hadn't gone and tested this in field experiments, is that schooling isn't just about learning, reading, and writing. It fundamentally changes the mind. It changes your capacity for cognition. And if you then look at good versus bad schools, the traditional metrics we tend to use, poor kids or in poor schools, test scores are lower or graduation rates are lower, those things don't give you an insight on the mechanism. They just say, okay, these are good and bad performing schools, but then you're left with very blunt policy instruments, which are let's give low performing schools money and let's see if we can get them to do better. But that's a very blunt instrument because you haven't really understood the problem. And so this study is just one example of how the R&D process for anti-poverty policy can work. We investigated data to generate leads on one particular area of opportunity, attentional capacity, which people hadn't recognized was there before. We used the social science, the cognitive psychology, to inform a potential intervention design. Then we went out into the world and tested it with a randomized trial. And now that's unlocked a potential for a very low cost and very imminently feasible policy intervention that you can actually go into schools and do tomorrow. So let me go to employment as a second example. So again, let me start with a psychology. So if you just go to low-income people and ask them, like, what's on your mind, financial worries are really top of mind. So these are Indian manufacturing workers, and if you just ask them, how worried are you about your finances, like 85% say very worried or quite worried. If you ask them, how often do you worry about your finances, half of them say every single day, and a lot of times at work. This is not unique to India. This is work by our colleague Chen Lian and co-authors. In a representative sample of Americans, they asked them, over the past weeks, how many working hours were you distracted by your financial concerns? So while you're at work. And the average American says that they spend about 6 hours a week distracted by thoughts of or worries about their finances. So that suggests a possibility that low-income people could become less productive when they need the money the most, when financial concerns are highest, when the health shock or the catastrophe is hit. So we wanted to test this idea. So we did a randomized trial with 400 workers in low-skill manufacturing in India. All of them were like working in these short-term contract jobs, like this is what people do in developing countries, and they were kind of owed their payment after this 10-day contract job. And all we did is we just took half of them and we paid them a bit earlier what they had already earned. So they're due wages from their employer, they've earned a certain amount. So on like day 6, we're just gonna pay you what you've earned up until day 6 early instead of making you wait all the way to day 10. And this is during the lean season when financial constraints are high. And so, but what we've done with that intervention is we've alleviated financial stress by pulling up some of the payment, but not changed how much we're paying people. Everyone's still gonna get paid the same amount of money. We've just changed the timing. And then we're gonna compare behavior across the people who got paid a little early with the people who were paid later, who are now still financially constrained. What do we find? So this is showing effects. So this is when the early payment hits for the treatment group, and the control group is still gonna get paid at the end. And the red circles are the richer workers in our sample, and the blue triangles are the poorer workers in our sample. And what this is plotting is a treatment effect. How much does productivity go up in what these guys are doing? And what you basically see is for the richer guys, it didn't matter that we paid them earlier or later. They just produced the same amount, right? The treatment effect is 0. For the poorer guys, it matters a lot. As soon as they get paid that money, they go home, they buy food, they pay off loans, and the next day they're more productive at work. And when you ask them, they do report feeling more focused at work. And you also just look at what they produce. They're making leaf plates, and we go and actually measure mistakes, like how long did it take them to make the plate, how many mistakes did they have to undo, and they're making fewer mistakes. There's fewer attentional lapses while they're at work. So another dimension where you can kind of see these effects is financial scarcity and parenting. So a lot of you might have heard, this sort of fact that by age 3, children from low-income families may hear 1 million words or 30 million words, pick your number, but like millions of words less by the time they enter school than kids from more affluent schools. And your verbal ability when you enter school is more predictive of later success than even parental income or anything else. So it's considered by developmental psychologists to be quite important. And so a colleague of mine and kind of my co-conspirator in this Psychology and Economics of Poverty initiative here at Berkeley did this study with co-authors where they actually have, they look at how much parents speak to their kids across the month. And you can kind of see, this is when the first paycheck arrives, this is when the second paycheck arrives, this is the end of the month when money is just really tight for Americans in general. And this is based on audio data from like thousands of recordings that researchers have done, so you actually can hear how much conversation is happening in the household. And you just see that when money is tight, the amount of conversation between parents and kids dips. So the same exact parent speaks less to their children when money is tight. And so when there's cash in a person's pocket, these two studies indicate that if you have the same person, when they have money in their pocket, they become a better worker, they become a more engaged parent who's talking to their toddler. And we sort of know that in both poor countries and rich countries, low-income people just have a ton of trouble smoothing money from paycheck to paycheck. We see these dips and the cyclicality. And this spills over into many facets of their life, including really important productive facets of their life. And so there's this need for thinking about how to help people smooth. This is an investment in their productivity. This is not just something that's good to do for people so they're not stressed. And in fact, if you survey Americans, 68% of Americans think that the products and services offered by their bank don't meet their financial needs. So what we did in our studies is just sort of a proof of concept. We paid some people earlier. That's not going to necessarily be the thing you always want to do. But what it's trying to put out there as an idea is that there's a scope for innovation among employers and among financial providers to help people manage this money management problem, to help them line up their expenses with their income so they don't have this insane amount of stress. Okay, so now let me go to the third example, which is savings. So first, let's start by just a snapshot of what does savings look like. A common sense would tell us savings is important. If you're low income, you save a little, you save the $10 at a time and you kind of save up and you climb your way out of poverty. In economic theory, from kind of a macro growth perspective, the savings rate is the thing that determines aggregate growth, how countries grow, what their steady state equilibrium level of GDP per capita is, and so on. So savings is super, super important. But low-income people seem to not really hold liquid savings. So this is data, again, from India that we collected. And we just went to a bunch of casual laborers and we asked them, if you needed to come up with 1,000 rupees for medical emergencies in two days, could you do that? And 1,000 rupees is just 4 days worth of wages. And only 30% of people say yes, and that includes borrowing. I could easily do it, either because I have it saved or I could go ask a friend for a loan or something. So that means the overwhelming majority of people don't even have 4 days worth of wages in liquid savings. And it's again not unique to developing countries. The Federal Reserve Board runs these surveys of Americans, and if you ask Americans, could you come up with $400 in an emergency, which is about, at the time when this was asked, about less than a week and a half of wages if you work a minimum wage job, only 60% of people say yes. So about 40% of Americans, and again, this includes if you put money on a credit card but paid it back at the end of the month. So the majority, so at least 40% of Americans don't have a week and a half worth of income saved up. People just aren't holding liquid savings. The other place you see savings issues cropping up are these cyclical seasonality. So this is a plot showing the incidence of hungry seasons in Zambia. So what happens in Zambia, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, is people harvest their crop once a year. You harvest your maize, corn, you get a bunch of money. That's your 90% of your income for the year, and then you eat it down over the course of the year. What I'm showing in the graph on the y-axis is the share of households that report having a food shortage. They just don't have enough to eat. And after harvest, that number is 2%. So people harvest and everybody has food to eat. But then as they go towards coming up to the next harvest, when that savings is depleted, now more than 50% of people say that I don't have enough food to eat. This is not true just in Zambia. We see these kinds of monthly cyclicality among food stamp recipients in the US. The food stamp hits your account, the money hits your SNAP benefits hit your account at the start of the month, and then by week 2 or 3, a lot of people have just depleted all of their SNAP benefits, and there's a 10 to 15% drop in calories from the beginning to the end of the month in the US, and so kids are going to school without eating breakfast. You see hospital admissions for hypoglycemia go up, so this is a pretty big impact. And so, and the consequences of this are big. When people have no savings or when they're not holding liquid savings, that's what triggers, I lost my job and now I'm evicted, because you had no buffer to rely on. So it's an incredibly big policy problem. So what do we do about it? And I have until 4:15, is that, yeah? Okay, I'm pretty sure, okay. So what should we do about it? The conventional wisdom would be to give people money to help them get through lean periods. Right? It's a very human thing. People just, clearly we're not giving people, for example, enough in food stamps. We're not helping people. People are harvesting maize, but clearly they don't have enough. And so we should go and give them assistance during the hungry season. And while I think that is quite important, I'm by no means saying that we should not be giving, transfers to people. But there's a complementary approach, again, where we could think about what is the underlying psychology behind these savings failures and think about, are there other targeted interventions we could do that help people save and meet their own goals? So let me get into the psychology of savings. So this is surveys that we did among low-income households in the US, where I'm just trying to give you a sense of how people, what their relationship with their savings is like. So if you ask people, how often does it happen, with the following statement: there are months where more expenses come up than I had initially expected. It's like a negative surprise, like more things come up than I expected. Nobody says never, very few people say rarely. Everyone's like, yeah, usually more expenses come up than I expected. If instead, in the dark blue, you ask people, there are months where less expenses come up than you expected, nobody agrees with that, right? Nobody agrees with that. Nobody's saying often or always for that. So it seems like people are always surprised in the wrong direction. But if you're surprised every month, it's not a surprise, but it feels like a surprise. So to make this a little more concrete, we went to a low-income household in Zambia, right, where we have these hungry seasons. And we went like a few months after harvest, and we said to them, okay, they harvest their maize and they store it in these like 50-kilogram bags. So we said, okay, you have a certain amount of maize like sitting in your house or in your granary right now. You have 20 bags of maize, whatever it is. If I come back in 3 months, how many bags of maize will you still have? We asked them to forecast how much savings they're gonna have 3 months from now. And if they're right, we give them some money. We're gonna actually show up in 3 months, we're gonna count the maize, we're gonna give you some money if you were like roughly right. And so we ask them for a guess, they give us a forecast. Then we say, what is the worst case scenario? What if everything that could possibly go wrong goes wrong? How much savings are you gonna have in 3 months? And then they give us a lower number, as you would expect. Then we go back 3 months later, and that's how much maize they actually have. So 83% of people are over-optimistic about their savings. And so about 80% of people are over-optimistic, and 65% of people have less maize than what they thought the worst case scenario was. And these are people with decades of experience, because they have lived this problem every year where there's a hungry season. But yet they still think this year will be better than last year, or this year won't be like that. Because last year, my mom got sick, my kid got malaria, my cart, whatever, broke, I had to sell extra maize because of that emergency, but that won't happen again. Because we as human beings don't think in terms of distributions, we're like, oh, that thing won't happen again. So part of this over-optimism about savings seems to be driven by an underappreciation of what kinds of expenses are likely to come down the pike. So we ask people to also forecast, how much are you gonna spend over the course of the year? What is your spending gonna be? How many expenses are you gonna have? That's their guess. We measure their expenses over the course of the year, that's how much they actually spend. So people are spending about double what they anticipate spending when we ask them at the start of the year. So this kind of over-optimism, I'm gonna have a lot of savings, this year won't be so bad, I'm not gonna have that many expenses, is ingrained in the human psyche. It has nothing to do with poverty. This is just a feature of human psychology. All people are over-optimistic about budgets. Corporations and people who are doing infrastructure projects like building roads are over-optimistic about time and budget. All of us are probably over-optimistic about time management. I know I certainly am. Like the fraction of days I get through my to-do list is like basically zero. People are over-optimistic about exercise goals, you name it. We are despite our cynicism, we are kind of an over-optimistic species in some ways. So if we can target the psychology that generates this over-optimism, can we help people meet their own goals? And so what we did is designed a very simple planning intervention. I mean, it took us 6 months in the field to do it, but it is simple in terms of the end product. So the one sort of these telltale things, these like behavioral features that I told you about, when you if you took that pattern of things and told them to a psychologist, they would be like, oh yeah, that's a planning fallacy. That's like a thing. We know that's a robust thing about human behavior. And what the planning fallacy is just this like over-optimism despite experience. And the way we can think about it in our research, we've micro-founded where this planning fallacy comes from. At least one of the reasons it appears is if you think about the budgeting problem, what is the budgeting problem? How do I decide how much money I can spend today? It's based on how much I have now and how much I think I'm gonna need for expenses in the future. But the expenses in the future are really numerous. There's like a ton of them. And they're small and they're irregular, so they're salient things like, my rent and my Netflix subscription and whatever. But there's also rare things, like I might remember my car payment, but not how much I need for gas. And I certainly might not remember that in 2 weeks I'm planning to go to Yosemite, and so I'm going to need extra gas for that weekend, because or in 1 month I'm planning to do that. So when we look forward in our budget, just because we have limited memory and limited cognition, it's easy to forget some of these small things. And we're very bad as a species in thinking about rare events. Like, of course, your kid's not going to get malaria again this year, but something else is probably going to happen. And what is the probability of all those rare things aggregated up? So given that, this can create over-optimism about how rich you are. You don't think you have to spend that much, so you feel much richer today, so that means I can afford to buy this thing. But then, as you go through the month or the year, those other expenses do come up, even though you didn't anticipate them, and by the end of the year, you're actually much poorer than you thought you were going to be, and then you have to cut back on food. So, what the planning fallacy literature has shown us then, if you can get people to have a more accurate sense of what's coming down the pike, they can do a better job with their beliefs. And so what we do is adopt that approach to create a planning board where we give people categories, food consumption each month, school fees, household supplies, farm inputs, so the big things they need to spend money on. And the reason this helps you be accurate is you might not remember I need to buy herbicide, but if I ask you what do you need to spend on farm inputs, you're more likely to remember herbicides because memory is associative. So we draw on that, and we just have people, we do this tactile activity where people we say, okay, how many bags of maize do you have? 20 bags, great. Here's 20 thumbtacks, allocate them to this board. And people start allocating thumbtacks, and they run out before they get to the end of the board, and they're like, oh, I can't spend as much as I thought on those earlier activities, so then they reallocate, and it makes them much more accurate about what's actually happening. And importantly, we don't give them any input or guidance, they do this themselves. So this kind of helps with the planning fallacy. It also helps with this relative thinking. It's like, when you have all this harvest and it's all sitting in your granary or all of your benefits come in, what difference does $5 make when I have $1,000 in the bank? When it's the end of the month and you only have $50 in the bank, $5 feels like a lot, but it doesn't feel like a lot in the beginning. So what this exercise helps people do is see that all of that money is accounted for. Now you are thinking in $50 increments, not $1,000 increments. And it also helps in terms of, there had some mental accounting features. Okay, so what is the impact of doing this with people? So we follow them for a year. So we did this randomized trial with 800 farm households in Zambia. And this blue dotted line is the control group. And this is how much they spend each week. So this is just their spending. You can see, people spend a lot shortly after harvest, and then here's the hungry season, and they're spending much less, and they're eating much less. We get the control group to increase savings by 15% right off the bat in the 2 months. When we go back 2 months after doing this intervention, they have 15% more savings. And then they can take that increased saving in the first few months and then spend it more smoothly in later parts of the year. So as a result of our intervention, treated households enter the hungry season with a month more worth of maize. And because they have this additional savings, this is also when planting is happening, so you kind of need to self-finance investment in your own farm. So they buy more fertilizer, they hire more labor on their land, and their yields go up by 9% at the end of the year, so they can enter the next year with a bigger pie. And just to benchmark these effects, we did this in an area where one of my co-authors in the study actually had done a cash grant program and a food grant program in the same exact part of Zambia, like a few years before this. And they had, by giving people a bunch of maize or giving them a bunch of cash, they got effects on things like yields and other things that are very similar to what we got, with just a simple 30-minute planning intervention. Of course, a fraction of the cost, because we weren't giving money away. We were just helping people shuffle money from here to here, so that they didn't regret what they spent over here by the time they actually got to the hungry season. So now we've done this process of R&D to think about the psychology of savings and develop an intervention, and now we're ready to take that insight to scale. So what are we doing now? We've done this initial experiment in Zambia. We're now working in Malawi with the 1 Acre Fund, which is a large African NGO, to scale this across Malawi. We actually just finished the pilot, and we're sort of scaling across the country next year, starting in March, and again, evaluating it with a randomized trial so that when we take it to scale, where we're not doing it, but we're actually teaching and embedding it into the operations of the organization so they can take it forward every year on their own without our involvement. We're evaluating that to make sure it still works. And if we find that that RCT is successful, then they will scale this across all 9 of the countries in Africa where they work. And then we're sort of pivoting to say, okay, well, now we have this insight. This is not just about farmers in Africa. This is relevant in the US, and we validated some of these effects on beliefs among low-income households in the US. And we're thinking about, okay, can we do this now with food stamp recipients? Can we embed this into cash transfer programs so that when people get that lump sum cash, it's not spent so quickly, they can be a little more deliberate about how it's spent. So I sort of started the talk by saying poverty is not just about low levels, it's about all these other things. And when you see all of those things on one screen, it seems like an overwhelming thing, right? And being poor is overwhelming, I think. So the struggles of poverty are overwhelming, but I think recognizing them presents a very clear opportunity, because all of those things have these psychological and social consequences. And if we recognize those and then think about, well, what do we know about how to target those underlying things, we can create much smarter and more effective policies without necessarily needing to spend more money, though I think it would be nice if we also spent more money. And so that's kind of the enterprise we're engaged in here at Berkeley. So we're engaged in this process of social R&D, and the economics department, and an initiative that I helped launch at the Center for Effective Global Action, CEGA, is the Psychology and Economics of Poverty initiative, which is joint with the psychology department here at Berkeley. And we're really working on sort of creating this interdisciplinary lab where psychologists and economists can come together and really understand the problem of poverty, both in developing countries and in rich countries like the US. And kind of the goals from this work is to use our understanding of social science and all of these diverse features of poverty to understand people's choices and behaviors, and then use that to increase the effectiveness of the money we currently spend by making poverty smarter and more psychologically informed. And as I hope I convinced you in this talk, also discovering entirely new dimensions of policy intervention that we're not even thinking, and shining the light on those and saying, here are opportunities that we can do that actually might help make a difference in people's lives. Okay, I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Supreet. What a tour de force. This is actually an enormous treat for me. Supreet and I started our journey in economics together, and day one we were in the same PhD program and cohort.
Yeah.
I've been learning from Supreet for 14 years. I get to learn more today. And for all of us wondering, how do alumni support, other friends support, help improve education here at Berkeley? Part of that is attracting people like Supreet. She started her career at Columbia, and thanks to the support of all of our friends, we were able to attract her here. And it's our students who get to benefit from her ideas, her perspective, her passion every day in class here on campus. So thank you for that. We are going to ask questions both from those submitted online, including the chat, so please feel free to put them in there, and also here live in the room. I'm going to start with a couple that were pre-submitted. Here in the room, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone. We'll make sure that you get one so that everyone listening back at home can also hear you. So Supreet, the first question actually has to do with, many people ask this type of question of, where do these ideas come from? You gave us the formula of develop leads, run the experiment, and then roll them out. I think if you gave me 50 years, I would never think of drawing some of these charts of how do things get better. I'm not going to talk less as the month goes on. So is it theory? Is it data? Is it talking to people? Is it reading the New York Times? Where do you get your ideas from?
Yeah, it's like one of the toughest questions in academia is how do you generate research ideas? And I think everybody has their own way of doing it. For me, it actually really comes from fieldwork, from going out into the field and talking to people. And so, for example, the savings study that I just presented actually came up because I was seeing, my co-author present her cash grant paper where she was like, we gave these grants and look, it really helped people. We gave them money in the hungry season. And I was like, but why? But this is a savings failure. Why aren't they just saved? Like, what's going on? And so then I went to Zambia with one of our PhD students here at Berkeley, and we just spent a bunch of time walking around villages and talking to people and gaining insights. And then we took those and started thinking about, okay, well, I've heard all of these things. Some of these things are puzzling. Like, why are they so over-optimistic? Why can't they recognize that this is going to keep happening? And so just from those conversations, I got a sense of the over-optimism. And when I came back to our interdisciplinary lab meetings that we hold, in the Psychology and Economics of Poverty initiative, I actually remember describing that, and like in 5 seconds, my psychology friends were like, well, that's the planning fallacy. And I'd never heard of it before. And I was like, oh, this is the planning fallacy. And that kind of then led us to say, okay, now let's collect the data. But the amazing thing about economics, I think, is that, so the planning fallacy is like so robust. Psychologists have developed these amazing interventions, but we as economists have this like ability to then go out into the world and test them at scale. So people had done this with like undergraduate studying for exams or that sort of thing. No one had tested in this kind of high stakes setting. No one had said, if you change beliefs, can you actually change real behaviors when the stakes are high? And that's, I think, where the economics comes in. So then we took those ideas, did a lot of field work and piloting to develop the intervention, figured out what data do we want to collect, and then we went and did it at scale. So that's a very typical process.
Psychology and economics, it's not just talk. It's wonderful. Another question that was pre-submitted, there are 40 versions of this question. So basically, who out there, domestically or internationally, organizations-wise, or programs that in the United States or in other countries seem to be doing it right? You said at the end, sometimes you can do better, not even by spending more money, but just by spending it in different ways. People talked about CalFresh, WIC, Head Start, the Grameen Bank. Are there places that you think are doing things really well? Or put differently, if you were in charge, where would you start?
This is like it's a cool question because there is so much innovation happening, and there's a lot of people, I think, who do understand these problems. I think some of it comes from the private sector, some of it in the public sector, some of it the NGO sector. I'll actually give an example of maybe something that maybe is like a little off the beaten path, because it's not maybe an organization that someone would just say. So when the government started issuing food stamps, you had a thing, you had a food stamp account, and the only way you would know how much money was left in your food stamp account is when you went to the grocery store and went to the checkout line. Like when you checked out, that's when you saw your balance. There was no way to know your balance. That is like the most psychologically stupid thing I could ever imagine, right? And so there's a organization that's actually a for-profit called now Propel, and they kind of launched this app called Fresh EBT, which now millions of food stamp users in the US are now on. And it's just like you open the app, you see what benefits you have left, and now on that app they've started building out other services. So for example, a lot of low-income people in this country don't claim their benefits, their tax, they don't file a tax return, they don't get a return, right? It's really hard to do. So now they just piloted 2 years ago, one of my friends who's there, piloted a thing to say we have a lot of your data, because now they went and linked it to your bank accounts and other things. They've kind of expanded their services for this population after drawing them in with this obvious benefit of being able to see your balance. And so now they basically made it so that they would just you can just file your tax return through the app essentially without having to go through all this hassle. And I think that kind of innovation of let's just cut down barriers, let's make things psychologically smarter. Or the US government used to give out your EITC benefits in one lump sum. So imagine getting $15,000 in one lump sum as a really low income person. That's the savings, the hungry seasons example, right? That's a really hard thing for a human being to manage. And so even shifting to now you can get it monthly or those kinds of things. I think there's just a ton of room for policy innovation. It's happening in a lot of places, but I don't think there's enough real attention to making things psychologically smarter.
Thank you. Is there a question to start in the room here? Just hold on one moment and we'll get you a microphone. Thank you.
So domestically, you had in the second and third idea in terms of paying people more frequently, or third, financial literacy or improving your financial management. On the second one, in the US, have you thought about working with the top payroll companies, the top 10 control 55 or 60% of payroll, and say, hey, if you give an incentive structure, because we run a small medium business, and they've never come to us and said, hey, if you pay more frequently, this is good for your employees, or you get an incentive to do it more often, to drive that, because that seems like an easy, 10 companies drive 60% of payroll in the United States. That's number one. And then number two is, how do you build the financial literacy, a lot of people, like poor individuals, don't even look at the stock market. They save. They just let it sit in the bank. And I've actually worked with employees and I said, you have this much money. Imagine if over 10 years you had invested that. And they go, why are you telling me this 10 years later? You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So how do we make it a reality with the innovation and learning that you're seeing in the, that you're providing?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I think the working with payroll companies is a great idea. I mean, I think we're very far. I would say, this study is like that I presented on the worker productivity is like the first instantiation of any evidence that if you like do this, you can make workers more productive. So I think just in good conscience, I would say we're still early in this like R&D process of like testing things out and understanding how does this interact with other kinds of behavioral biases, other things that people need. But I think of it as a proof of concept that there is possibility for like this kind of innovation. And I think it's a great idea. Like I would love to see more research. Like we're in the very early stages. Like a lot of these studies, you saw the years were 2022, 2023, 2024. Like this is just a very new field of economics and psychology. And I think that kind of innovation is exactly where we should go. In terms of financial literacy, I think that it is like when you're a low-income person who's subject to so much volatility, why don't you, go put your money in the stock market? I think there's many reasons. People have views on many reasons why low-income people don't invest in the stock market. But I think might be not psychologically crazy for a few different reasons. But also I think there are policy interventions in terms of like making things easier and more accessible that make it possible for people to like feel comfortable in doing things like that. And that applies not just to the stock market, but also like, why didn't you sign up for your food stamp benefits? Why does the process feel so daunting? Why is it as a government, we don't pay attention to the actual user experience of like signing up for benefits or using the stock market or these things? And I think paying attention to that could have big impacts.
Thank you. I loved so many things about your presentation.
Thank you.
So I come from philanthropy, and one of the things that I've observed is that there are a lot of efforts to try to address each of the individual things that you mentioned. For example, like payday lending and kind of monetizing the desperation that people have when they have volatility in their payment, and financial literacy. Teaching someone that maybe doesn't have that planning capacity to. But what I've observed is sometimes it's almost used as a weapon instead of as a support, because then it's the excuse, oh, well, someone is poor because they don't know how to manage their money, and it's their responsibility. And so I think something that came out of that, and I'm going to get to the questions, something that came out of that was, shifting from something specific like financial literacy to something holistic, like how do we treat someone that's homeless, combination of medical needs, combination of emotional needs, and what do you think are the risks and benefits of your work and people taking it piecemeal to serve a specific agenda versus how important is it to hold it all together, especially when approaching policy issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I think the holistic is incredibly important. Like I had a friend who had a community health worker startup in Harlem where they were like helping using kind of a developing country model in the US where you send people out into the community to help them with like adherence to their insulin regimen or, so on, with big effects. But they said ultimately we're having these big effects, but the single biggest predictor of if you're adhering to your medicines is if you have like housing security, right? And so I think that's to your point. Like these things, there's these like big things, and that's why this is not just all like the policy environment matters, having low-income housing matter. All of those things obviously really, really matter. As economists would say, you have to get the prices right before you do anything else. Kind of that basic thing matters. But I think that but I think if you say you have to do all of those things that I put up there at once, that's an impossible task. So we do need to be able to break things apart. And I think what the research does is it helps us understand what those interactions are. What are the interactions that are important? So then where do we need to take things together versus separately? And there's no way to know that without doing the research behind it. And there are some things like the examples I gave you, like the savings intervention. We didn't change anything else. We just did this thing and it had pretty transformative impacts. So I do think wins like that are also possible. But again, you need the research to figure it out.
A few slides ago, you had the consumption smoothing failure in your intervention. Do you know what the ideal line looks like? Because it's probably not going to look like perfectly smooth. But like, were you most of the way there, or is there like still a huge gap between what people really like want?
Yeah, I think that there's not a great way to know that because, as you said, it's not going to look smooth. I think the best way to do that is just to ask people, what do you think you would want your line to look like? And I don't think they would say perfectly smooth, but I think they would say it to be smoother than even what we got it to.
Hi, in some of these charts, clearly an impact on some of the ideas you're putting out there. How much correlation is there, do you think, with poor countries where you went versus poor communities in the US? Is it human nature or is it cultural? And how much translates?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that we ourselves in this literature of struggles design, the center that we started, it sits within this, Development Economics Center, but it very explicitly our mandate is poverty, whether it's in the US or anywhere else. And it's driven by this view that psychology is universal, but the institutions are very different. And so that doesn't mean then the policies and so on and even behaviors are going to be the same because those things interact back to this holistic point. But I think the reason there is a lot of commonality is let's go back to the definition of poverty. Being poor by definition, what is the poverty line? It's the minimum amount of money you need to buy food, buy grocery, buy rent, buy clothing, like these basic necessities. So someone who is poor does not have enough money to fulfill their basic needs. And the psychological impacts of that, I think, there's a universality to those. So that's why I think a lot of things do translate. And that's why a lot of the examples kind of were both US and.
Jennifer?
Hi, thank you for this. How did you get people to want to participate in your savings program? How did you convince them that they could actually save and benefit from saving?
Yeah, so I think what we did is we went to people and we said, here's this thing for free. It's embedded in a survey. If you take the survey, you get some soap. And because we needed to collect data from them. We're going to come back every 2 months, and every time you fill out, and we of course go through an important a IRB process, and in terms of are the incentives you're given, are they too big? And so we're kind of required to give incentives that are pretty modest. But I think people in general were very open to this idea that I have this hungry season. And I think we didn't face much. We had almost nobody be like, I don't want to participate, because of course people consent in just like they do in the US. What I think is telling is once we did this, in year 2, we went back to people and we just said, would you be willing to pay to get this again? And 95% of people were willing to pay us something to get it again. So I think that there's a sense in whether they, maybe they might have thought maybe this is good in beforehand, but after the fact, they really recognize it as something helpful.
One more question in the back.
I can't thank you enough for this. It's so exciting to hear the combination of economics and psychology. You don't usually hear that. I live in downtown Martinez, and I live right on the refinery fence line. And so the idea of combining psychology with the economics of pollution is very exciting. And I can't wait to see what else comes from this kind of, really creative thinking. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, let me close it out with one question that's related to this. So how do you build trust, not just with, so this is coming from the chat, thank you for those participating by Zoom. How do you build trust, not just with the participants, but also the local organizations, the communities that you're working in? There's this whole ecosystem that makes it possible to run all these programs and learn all this important information.
It's incredibly important. And so it's very culturally dependent. So the way you do this in India is really different from how you do it in Zambia or Malawi. So for example, when we did this in Zambia, the first point of entry when you enter a village, the first thing we would do is go talk to the village chief. We meet them, we tell them what we're doing, we show them the planning board, they have a good idea of what we're doing. And then we go, and then they kind of have, there's usually an assistant or something, they appoint that person, and that person goes around with us when we go to the different households. And so that is very important, both then for people to be able to trust you. This also gets to this idea of how did you convince people to participate. People then trust you and kind of creates that local accountability.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hand it off to Tara to segue for those here locally into drinks and more questions.
Thank you, Danny. Hello, I'm Tara Horton. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Development for the Social Sciences at UC Berkeley. I want to thank our participants, Sarah Rahimian for the nice introduction, Dean Rocca Ray, Professor Kaur, Professor Yagan. Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I also want to thank our donors to Berkeley Economics and to the Social Sciences Annual Funds. Your sustaining support makes a direct impact on our students and faculty and makes the research, the kind of research that you saw here today, possible. Thank you very much. The next event in our economics speakers series is going to feature Professor Maury Obstfeld on the challenges to international economic cooperation, and that's on November 21st, and it will be in San Francisco. Once again, thank you for coming and enjoy the reception.
You pulled it off. Good job.
Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed talking.